I found out I no longer had the right to sign my own paperwork on a Tuesday morning at 9:17 a.m., standing barefoot in my kitchen. It came as a polite email, nothing dramatic, just a line saying my access had been updated. I assumed it was a system error until I noticed my name missing from a document I'd approved for years. What stayed with me wasn't the email. It was the coffee mug on the counter still warm while I realized everything I trusted had already moved on without me. I found out I no longer had the right to sign my own paperwork on a Tuesday morning at 9:17 a.m., standing barefoot in my kitchen. I remember the time because my phone buzzed just as the kettle clicked off. Steam fogged the window above the sink, and my dog, Milo, was circling my legs, impatient for his walk. It wasn't a dramatic moment. No raised voices, no confrontation. Just a notification sliding across my screen while I reached for a mug I've owned since college, the one with the chipped handle I refused to throw away. The email was polite, almost friendly. Your access has been updated to reflect recent organizational changes. That was it. No warning. No explanation, no signature, just a line of text that looked like every other corporate email I'd ever received. I assumed it was a system error. Those happened all the time. New software rollout, permissions resetting, someone in IT clicking the wrong box. I'd been working in municipal procurement long enough to know that glitches were part of the job. So I did what I always did. I opened my laptop, logged into the shared drive, and pulled up the vendor agreement I'd reviewed the night before. My name wasn't there. Not crossed out, not replaced, just gone. The signature block that had carried my name for the last 6 years now sat empty, like it had never belonged to anyone at all. I refreshed the page. Same result. I checked the version history, scrolling back through timestamps and edits, watching the document revert and reload. Every version from the past 3 weeks showed the same thing. No Emily Carter, no title. No initials in the margin. At first, my reaction wasn't panic. It was confusion. The kind that makes you tilt your head and squint, like maybe you're looking at something from the wrong angle. I told myself I must be tired. I'd stayed up too late the night before, reviewing compliance notes while half watching a rerun of a show I barely remembered. I'd skipped dinner. My brain was probably lagging. Still, something in my chest tightened in a way that had nothing to do with caffeine. I scrolled further. My access level had been changed from approver to viewer. Viewer. As in, allowed to look, not allowed to act. I stared at the word longer than I needed to. It felt heavier than it should have, like it meant more than its definition. I thought about the contracts I'd signed just days earlier. The emergency purchase order for new traffic cameras. The maintenance agreement for the city's water meters. Documents that carried legal weight, the kind that could be subpoenaed, audited, challenged. Documents I'd been trusted with because I was careful, because I didn't miss details, because I followed the rules even when it slowed things down, because my name mattered. Or at least, I thought it did. I clicked into my email archive and searched my own name. Nothing. No warnings, no meetings scheduled, no messages marked urgent. Just the usual clutter calendar invites, vendor questions, a reminder about a staff training I'd already completed. The kettle had gone cold by then. My coffee sat untouched on the counter, a thin skin forming on top. Milo whined softly, leash still hanging by the door. I should have called my supervisor right then. That would have been the reasonable thing to do. Ask for clarification, flag the issue, get it fixed before it became a bigger problem. But something stopped me. It wasn't fear. Not exactly. It was the quiet certainty that this hadn't been a mistake. Because mistakes leave fingerprints. Sloppy emails, half explanations, apologies that come a little too late. This had been clean, efficient, executed without a ripple. Someone had decided I no longer needed to be included, and they'd done it in a way that required no conversation. I closed my laptop and stood there for a moment, barefoot on the cold tile, listening to the hum of the refrigerator and the distant sound of a lawnmower starting up down the block. It was a normal Tuesday in late April, the kind of morning where nothing bad was supposed to happen. I'd built my life around that assumption. I wasn't reckless. I didn't take risks for the thrill of it. I followed processes. I documented everything. I believed that if you showed up, did your job well, and didn't cut corners, the system would protect you. That was the deal. You give it your time and integrity, and it gives you stability in return. That belief had carried me through a lot. A divorce that ended quietly, without lawyers or drama. A move from Chicago to a mid-sized city in Ohio that no one ever dreams about but a lot of people end up in. A career that didn't make dinner party conversation exciting but paid my mortgage and let me sleep at night. I wasn't important enough to be targeted, I told myself. That was always my comfort. I stayed under the radar. I wasn't political. I wasn't ambitious in a way that threatened anyone. I did my job, went home, walked my dog, paid my bills. People like me didn't get erased. By 9:43 a.m., I was in my car, driving to the office with the radio off. Traffic was light. A delivery truck idled at the corner near City Hall, its hazard lights blinking in a steady rhythm. I parked in my usual spot, the one with the cracked curb, and sat there longer than I needed to. Inside the building, everything looked the same. The security guard nodded at me. The fluorescent lights flickered like they always did. Someone had left a box of donuts in the break room with a handwritten note that said, "Help yourself," in blue marker. No one looked at me like something had changed. At my desk, I logged in again, just to be sure. Same result. Viewer access. My name absent. The internal directory still listed me under my title, but when I clicked through, half the links led to error messages. I opened a contract at random and scrolled to the approval section. 3 names appeared, none of them mine. One of them belonged to someone who'd been here less than a year. I leaned back in my chair and folded my hands in my lap, a habit I'd picked up in meetings when I was trying not to interrupt. Around me, keyboards clicked, phones rang. Someone laughed near the copier. The office moved on, unaware that something fundamental had shifted. At 10:12 a.m., I received another email. This one was even shorter. Please route all procurement-related inquiries through your department lead until further notice. No greeting, no explanation, just instructions. That was the moment I understood the cost. Not in dollars, not in job title, but in credibility. In the quiet authority you build over years and lose in seconds. In the way people stop coming to you with questions, stop copying you on emails, stop assuming you have a say. I forwarded the message to myself and archived it without responding. What I didn't know then, what I couldn't have known, was that this wasn't the beginning of a problem. It was the aftermath, and by the time I realized what had been taken from me, the decision had already been signed, filed, and justified by people who would later swear they'd done nothing wrong. That morning, standing in my kitchen with a cold cup of coffee and an email that erased my name, I still believed the system corrected itself. I still believed there were rules. I still believed that if something was wrong, it would show its hand. I was wrong. If you'd asked anyone who worked with me to describe my life, they would have used words like solid, reliable, or low maintenance. No one would have said dramatic. No one would have said fragile. I had spent years making sure of that. I lived in a 3-bedroom colonial on the quieter side of town, the kind of neighborhood where kids rode bikes in the evenings and people waved without knowing each other's names. My mortgage payment hit my account on the first of every month like clockwork. My car was 6 years old, clean, and paid off. My fridge always had milk, eggs, and leftovers in neatly labeled containers. There was nothing in my life that required explanation. That had always been the goal. I worked for the city as a senior procurement analyst, a role most people didn't understand and rarely asked about twice. I wasn't the person cutting ribbons or giving interviews. I was the one making sure contracts were legal, bids were compliant, and vendors didn't slip questionable clauses into fine print. When things went wrong, my name was usually buried somewhere in a spreadsheet that proved I'd flagged the issue early. I liked it that way. After my divorce, I learned quickly that stability wasn't something you waited for. It was something you constructed, piece by piece, until it held your weight. My marriage hadn't ended in flames or betrayal. It had ended the way some things do quietly, with a shared acknowledgement that neither of us was becoming better inside it. We split the furniture, signed the papers, and stopped pretending. I moved back closer to my parents for a while, then farther away once I realized proximity didn't equal comfort. When the city in Ohio posted the procurement opening, I applied without romanticizing it. It wasn't Chicago. It wasn't exciting, but it offered a salary that made sense and a department that valued process over personality. I became good at my job in the way that doesn't show up on LinkedIn. I remembered which vendors always missed deadlines. I noticed patterns in bid submissions. I kept emails that other people deleted. I followed up when it would have been easier not to. Over time, people stopped double-checking my work. Not because it wasn't important, but because they trusted it. That trust mattered to me more than recognition. I didn't socialize much with coworkers outside office hours. I attended the occasional retirement party or holiday potluck, brought a casserole, stayed long enough to be polite, then went home. My friendships existed mostly outside of work, built around routine rather than intensity. Tuesday, trivia nights. Saturday morning yoga. The dog park at the same time every evening, where Milo had developed a rivalry with a golden retriever named Hank. I liked predictability. I liked knowing what came next. That's why the disappearance of my name unsettled me in a way I couldn't immediately articulate. It wasn't just about authority or access. It was about the quiet agreement I'd built my life on, that if you stayed within the lines would hold. By the end of that first day, I still hadn't said anything. I answered emails that didn't require approvals. I reviewed documents I was allowed to see. I attended a meeting where my input would normally have been expected and stayed silent when no one asked for it. The meeting ended early. People filed out. No one noticed. That night, I took Milo for a longer walk than usual. The air smelled like freshly cut grass and rain. Porch lights flicked on as the sky darkened. I tried to tell myself I was overreacting, that this was a temporary adjustment, that tomorrow would bring clarity. But clarity didn't come. The next morning, my calendar had been edited. 2 recurring meetings removed. 1 new meeting added. Department sync, scheduled for Friday afternoon. No agenda, no explanation. The organizer wasn't my supervisor, but someone 2 levels above me, a man I'd exchanged exactly 3 emails with in 6 years. I searched my inbox for his name. The emails were all brief, all neutral, all procedural. Nothing that suggested conflict. I thought about calling my supervisor again. She was out of the office that week, a detail I hadn't noticed until it mattered. Her auto-reply said she'd have limited access to email. I drafted a message anyway, read it twice, then saved it as a draft. There was a difference between being patient and being invisible. I just wasn't sure yet which one I was. At lunch, I ate at my desk like I usually did, scrolling through a local news site I followed out of habit more than interest. A headline caught my eye, something about a city audit, budget overruns, an upcoming council review. I skimmed it without connecting the dots. Procurement always showed up in audits. It was part of the ecosystem. I closed the tab and went back to work. Over the next few days, small things kept happening. Requests that used to come directly to me were rerouted. Documents I'd drafted were returned with minor edits from someone else's name. My access to a vendor portal was revoked, pending review. Each change, on its own, was easy to explain away. Together, they formed a pattern. Still, I didn't panic. I didn't confront anyone in the hallway or send emails demanding answers. That wasn't my style. I believed in waiting for facts, not reacting to feelings. I believed that if there was a problem, it would present itself clearly, the way problems always had. On Thursday evening, my mother called. We spoke once a week, usually about nothing important. She asked about work. I told her it was fine. I didn't mention the access changes or the missing meetings. I wasn't ready to turn uncertainty into something real by saying it out loud. After we hung up, I sat on the couch with Milo's head in my lap and thought about how carefully I'd arranged my life to avoid being caught off guard. I had savings. I had insurance. I had backups for my backups. I had always assumed that if something went wrong, it would be loud enough to prepare for. This wasn't loud. This was quiet, methodical, and strangely impersonal. Friday arrived faster than I expected. The department sync meeting was scheduled for 3:30 p.m., a time that suggested no one wanted it to run long. I printed my notes anyway, even though I wasn't sure what I was preparing for. Old habits die hard. When I walked into the conference room, I noticed the seating arrangement first. My usual chair was taken. I chose another without comment and placed my notebook on the table. Around me, people chatted about weekend plans. Someone mentioned a kid's soccer game. Someone else complained about traffic on the highway. No one acknowledged that I hadn't been speaking in meetings all week. The man who'd scheduled the meeting cleared his throat and thanked everyone for coming. He talked about alignment and streamlining processes. He used words that sounded intentional without being specific. I listened, pen resting on the page, waiting for my cue. It never came. At the end of the meeting, he handed out a one-page summary. I scanned it quickly. My role wasn't mentioned. Not once. As people stood to leave, he caught my eye for the first time. He smiled politely, the way you smile at someone you don't know well. "We'll follow up if we need anything," he said. I nodded. I didn't ask what "we" meant. That night, driving home with the radio off again, I understood something I'd been avoiding all week. This wasn't about performance. It wasn't about mistakes. It wasn't even personal in the way I'd been taught to recognize. This was structural. Something had shifted above me, around me, without my participation. Decisions had been made in rooms I wasn't invited into, based on assumptions I hadn't been asked to address. My life, the one I'd built to be unremarkable and safe, hadn't protected me. It had made me easy to move. At home, I fed Milo, poured myself a glass of water, and opened my laptop one more time. I didn't check my email. Instead, I opened a folder I hadn't touched in years, the one where I kept old contracts, archived memos, and drafts I'd never sent. I wasn't looking for proof yet. I was just trying to understand the shape of the silence. Because whatever was happening, it wasn't temporary. And the life I thought I'd built on predictability was about to test whether it could survive being quietly rewritten. There was one person I trusted enough not to worry about any of this. His name was Mark Reynolds, and for most of my time at the city, he'd been the constant. Not my supervisor in the strict sense, but close enough that the distinction rarely mattered. He'd been there when I was hired, there when the department reorganized, there when procurement got folded under finance, and everyone panicked about reporting lines. Mark was the one who explained things without making you feel small, the one who knew how City Hall actually worked instead of how it pretended to. He was also the reason I'd stayed. Mark had been my reference when I applied. He'd called me after the interview, his voice calm and familiar, and said, "They'd be lucky to have you. You'll do well here." I believed him because he didn't flatter. He was in his early 50s then, divorced, 2 kids in college, the kind of man who wore the same navy blazer to every meeting and never forgot anyone's name. When people asked me who I reported to, I usually said, "Mark." Even when the org chart said something more complicated, it was easier, more accurate too. That's why, as the week unfolded and my access quietly vanished, I kept telling myself that Mark would know, that if something had changed, he'd explain it, that there was context I was missing, a reason that would make sense once someone took the time to lay it out. Mark wasn't someone who blindsided people. He believed in process, in communication, in doing things the right way, even when it was inconvenient. Or at least, that's what I thought. I hadn't spoken to him since the Monday before everything started shifting. He'd been out of town for a regional conference, something about inter-municipal purchasing standards. We'd exchanged a brief email, him asking me to keep an eye on a vendor escalation, me confirming I would, nothing unusual. On Thursday afternoon, I finally walked down the hall to his office. The door was open, as it almost always was. Mark sat at his desk, glasses low on his nose, scrolling through something on his monitor. He looked up when he saw me and smiled. That same easy expression I'd seen 100 times. "Hey, Emily," he said. "What's up?" For a split second, I considered pretending everything was fine, asking about the conference, making small talk, leaving with nothing resolved and telling myself I'd tried. Instead, I stepped inside and closed the door halfway. "I wanted to ask you something," I said. "Have there been any changes to procurement approvals this week?" He didn't answer right away. That pause was small, barely a second, but it landed heavy. Mark leaned back in his chair, folding his hands over his stomach, a gesture I recognized from budget meetings when things were about to get complicated. "There's been some restructuring," he said carefully. "Nothing to be concerned about." I waited. "In what sense?" I asked. He cleared his throat. We're streamlining, reducing redundancies, making sure oversight is consistent across departments. That language again? Vague, polished, designed to sound reassuring without committing to anything. My access was downgraded, I said, and my name was removed from active approvals. Mark nodded, as if this were something he'd expected me to say. Yes, he said. I was aware that might happen. Might happen. As if it were weather. When? I asked. He glanced at his screen, then back at me. Earlier this month. There were discussions. Discussions I hadn't been part of. And no one thought to tell me? I said, keeping my voice steady. Mark sighed. Emily, this isn't a reflection of your performance. You've done excellent work. You know that. That's not what I asked. He leaned forward now, resting his elbows on the desk. These decisions are made at a higher level. Sometimes communication lags. Sometimes. I thought of the emails, the clean execution, the absence of fingerprints. Who made the call? I asked. Mark hesitated again. There's an interim review underway, he said. It's not personal. That was when something inside me shifted. Not anger. Not yet. Just a recalibration. A recognition that the person I'd trusted to translate the system for me was now speaking on its behalf. Am I part of this review? I asked. He smiled, a tight expression that didn't reach his eyes. You're adjacent to it. Adjacent. Like a bystander. So I lose authority without input, I said. Without notice. And I'm expected to just... Wait. For now, Mark said. Yes. I nodded, the way I always did when I was processing information. And the Friday meeting? Department sync, he said. Routine. My role wasn't mentioned. He shrugged lightly. Roles evolve. I stood there for a moment, absorbing the distance that had opened between us. The familiarity I'd relied on felt thinner, stretched over something harder beneath. I would have appreciated a heads up, I said. Mark looked almost apologetic. I understand. But he didn't say he was sorry. I left his office with the same measured steps I'd walked in with, but the hallway felt different. Longer. Brighter. Like a place I was visiting instead of belonging to. That evening, I replayed the conversation in my head while making dinner. I chopped onions, stirred sauce, set a plate down at the table I usually ate at alone. Everything was normal. That was the problem. Mark hadn't denied anything. He hadn't lied. Not exactly. He'd simply placed himself on the other side of the decision, as if it had passed through him rather than originated there. It occurred to me then that trust isn't about how long you've known someone. It's about where they stand when standing still becomes uncomfortable. Over the next few days, I noticed Mark less. Not physically, he was still there, still attending meetings, still sending emails, but in the way he interacted with me. He stopped looping me into conversations, stopped asking for my read on vendor issues. When I spoke in meetings, he nodded but didn't engage. It was subtle, professional, easy to miss if you weren't looking for it. I started looking. I paid attention to who spoke when I didn't, who answered questions that used to come my way, who forwarded emails that bypassed me entirely. Patterns emerged, the way they always do if you're patient enough. Mark was still involved. Deeply. He just wasn't involving me. One afternoon, as I walked past his office again, I saw him laughing with someone from finance, heads close together, voices low. On his desk sat a folder I recognized, one I'd created months earlier, labeled with a vendor name I'd spent weeks vetting. He noticed me in the doorway and straightened, the laughter disappearing. Hey, he said. Everything good? Fine, I said. And that was the truth, in the narrowest sense. Nothing was on fire. No one was shouting. My paycheck still cleared. My title still existed, at least on paper. But the relationship I'd built my sense of safety around had quietly changed shape. That night, I pulled out my old notebooks, the ones I'd kept from my first years at the city. Meeting notes, drafts, marginal comments. Not because I planned to use them, but because they reminded me of who I'd been when I started, careful, yes, but not naive. I realized then that my mistake hadn't been trusting Mark. It had been assuming that trust was permanent. Whatever was happening now involved him, directly or indirectly, and if I wanted to understand it, I would have to stop expecting him to explain it for me. For the first time since my name disappeared, I felt something solid take hold beneath the confusion. Not fear, awareness. And once you see the relationship clearly the way it actually operates, not the way you remember it, you can't unsee it. That was when I stopped waiting for permission to understand what was being done to me, and started paying attention to how. Once I started paying attention, it wasn't hard to see the cracks. They'd been there all along. I just hadn't known where to look. The first thing I noticed was how often my name came up without being attached to anything. In meetings, someone would reference that issue Emily flagged last year, or the concern procurement raised back in Q2. But no one would look at me when they said it. The credit floated in the room, detached, like a memory everyone agreed existed but didn't belong to a person anymore. At first, I told myself it was coincidence. People are careless with language. They generalize. They forget. But it kept happening, in rooms where I was sitting right there, taking notes like I always had. Then there were the emails. I'd get forwarded messages halfway down a chain, stripped of context. Decisions already made. Vendors already contacted. I was included just enough to stay informed, not enough to influence anything. When I replied with clarifying questions, the answers came back vague or delayed, as if my input were an inconvenience rather than a safeguard. Once, I caught a mistake before it went out, a compliance issue buried in a rushed amendment. I flagged it immediately, attaching the relevant policy language, offering a clean fix. The response I got back was a single sentence. Noted. The amendment went out unchanged. 2 days later, Finance sent a correction notice. The mistake had cost the city a small penalty. Not enough to make headlines, but enough to leave a mark. In the follow-up meeting, someone said, "We'll tighten review going forward." No one mentioned that the issue had been identified in advance. I started keeping track. Not formally, not yet. Just mentally. Dates, names, the order in which things happened. It wasn't paranoia. It was pattern recognition, the same skill that had made me good at my job in the first place. Another small thing. My badge stopped opening the side entrance near procurement. I had to walk around the building to get in, passing through the main lobby where visitors checked in. When I asked facilities about it, they said access points were being standardized. Standardized for whom? They didn't say. I shrugged it off, adjusted my routine. But the adjustment itself stayed with me. The way you remember an object that's been moved just slightly from where it's always been. The strangest moment came the following Wednesday. I was reviewing a bid submission when a junior analyst stopped by my desk. She looked nervous, twisting the strap of her tote bag in her hands. "Hey, she said, lowering her voice. I was told to route questions through Tom now. Tom had been hired 8 months earlier. Smart enough, eager, still learning. Questions about what? I asked. She glanced toward the hallway, then back at me. Procurement approvals. Vendor compliance stuff? I nodded slowly. Who told you that? She hesitated. Mark? There it was, quiet, unadorned. Okay, I said. Thanks for letting me know. She lingered, like she wanted to say more, then left without doing it. I watched her walk away and felt the familiar urge to smooth things over, to clarify, to protect the workflow. I didn't. Instead, I closed the document I'd been reviewing and stared at my desktop background, a photo of Lake Michigan from a trip years ago, gray water under a low sky. I'd kept it as a reminder that calm didn't always mean shallow. By the end of that week, I was tired in a way sleep didn't fix. Not physically, cognitively. Every interaction required recalibration. Every email needed rereading. I had to decide, over and over, whether to speak or stay quiet, whether to assert or observe. On Friday, I received a calendar invite for a meeting I'd never been part of before. Compliance review, closed session. I opened it out of reflex, then paused. My name wasn't on the attendee list. I hovered over the forward button, considering whether to ask why I'd been sent the invite at all. Then I noticed something else. The invite had been forwarded to me by Mark. No note, no explanation, just forwarded. I declined without responding. That night, at home, I sat at my kitchen table with my laptop open but untouched. Milo slept at my feet, twitching in his dreams. Outside, a neighbor's porch light flicked on, illuminating the edge of my window. I thought about all the times I'd stepped in quietly to protect people who hadn't known they needed it. The contracts I'd slowed down to make sure they were airtight. The vendors I'd pushed back on when shortcuts looked tempting. The meetings I'd stayed late for so other departments could leave early. None of that had been loud. None of it had been strategic. I'd done it because it was right. I'd assumed that mattered. The next Monday brought a new development. An internal memo circulated announcing a temporary reallocation of responsibilities, pending audit findings. Procurement authority would be consolidated to ensure clarity. My role was listed under support functions. Support. I read the memo twice, then a third time, tracing the language like a map. It was carefully written, neutral, defensible. If anyone asked, it would be easy to point to process, to oversight, to good governance. What it didn't say was who had raised concerns, or what those concerns were, or why the reallocation hadn't involved the person whose authority was being removed. I printed the memo and folded it into my bag. That afternoon, I overheard two colleagues talking near the break room. "They're just being cautious," one said. "After everything." "Yeah," the other replied. "Better safe than sorry." I didn't ask what everything meant. I was beginning to understand that whatever narrative was forming, it didn't include me as a participant. It cast me as a variable to be managed, not a voice to be heard. And yet, no one had accused me of anything. No one had documented a failure. No one had pointed to a mistake with my name attached. That was the unsettling part. In my experience, accusations had shape. They came with emails, meetings, performance plans. They were uncomfortable but tangible. You could respond to them. This was different. This was subtraction without explanation. That evening, I took Milo to the dog park later than usual. The lights cast long shadows across the grass. Hank, the golden retriever, wasn't there. A few unfamiliar dogs ran in loose circles while their owners chatted near the fence. I sat on a bench and watched Milo sniff the ground, moving farther away than he usually did. He stopped, looked back at me, then continued on. I realized then how much I'd relied on familiarity to orient myself, how easy it was to mistake routine for safety. The small things I'd dismissed, emails, access points, seating arrangements, weren't random. They were instructions. Signals that told others where I stood, even if no one bothered to tell me directly. By the time Milo trotted back, tail wagging, I'd made a quiet decision. I wasn't going to confront anyone yet. Not Mark, not finance, not the nameless, higher level everyone kept referencing. I needed to see the full picture. And that meant letting the small things continue, long enough to understand what they were building toward. Because whatever was happening wasn't impulsive. It was careful. And care, I was learning, could be used for more than protection. For a while, I thought what they were taking from me was authority. That was the easiest explanation, the cleanest. Authority is measurable. It shows up in org charts and approval thresholds, in who signs and who waits. Losing it hurts, but it's familiar. People lose authority all the time. Sometimes they earn it back. Sometimes they don't. I could have lived with that. What took longer to understand was that authority wasn't the real asset at risk. It was just the visible layer, the part everyone could point to without admitting what sat underneath. What they were taking was something quieter. My credibility. Not in the sense of reputation. No one was whispering about me in hallways. No one was questioning my competence out loud. On paper, I was still solid, dependable, experienced. If you asked anyone directly, they would have said I did good work. But credibility isn't just what people say about you when asked. It's what the system assumes about you when you're not in the room. I started to see it in the way questions were framed. In the meetings I attended but no longer influenced, people spoke about procurement risks as abstract concerns instead of issues with names and histories attached. Context disappeared, nuance flattened. Decisions became cleaner, faster, and worse. Once, during a meeting about a vendor renewal, someone said, "We've never had issues with them." I had. I'd documented them. Minor at first, then escalating. Late deliveries, missed reporting deadlines. A clause they'd tried to slide past us the year before. I opened my mouth to speak, then closed it again. I wasn't sure if I was allowed to. That was new. I'd never been someone who enjoyed the sound of my own voice. I didn't speak unless I had something to add. But now, the calculation had changed. Speaking meant risk. Risk of being seen as territorial. Risk of being labeled resistant. Risk of confirming whatever unspoken narrative justified my removal from decision-making. So I stayed quiet and watched the contract move forward. 2 weeks later, the vendor missed another deadline. This time, it wasn't logged as a compliance issue. It was written off as an unexpected delay. Unexpected to whom? I wondered. The longer this went on, the clearer it became that the value I brought to the department had never been my title. It had been my memory, my continuity, my ability to connect what was happening now to what had happened before. That kind of value doesn't show up on dashboards. It lives in people. And people can be edited out. One afternoon, I was asked to help prepare documentation for an external audit. Not lead it, just support, pull records, organize files. The work I'd done dozens of times before, now framed as assistance instead of stewardship. I agreed without comment. As I worked through the files, something caught my attention. A gap. Not a missing document, but a change in how approvals were logged. A subtle shift in timestamps. The same names appearing in sequences that didn't quite make sense. At first, I assumed it was a formatting issue. Then I realized it wasn't. The approval process had been restructured in a way that redistributed accountability. Where once responsibility had been clear, one signature, one decision, it was now diffused across multiple roles. If something went wrong, it would be harder to trace, harder to pin down, cleaner on the surface, messier underneath. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen longer than necessary. This wasn't about efficiency. It was about insulation. I thought back to the audit headline I'd skimmed weeks earlier and felt something settle into place. The city wasn't reacting to a problem yet, it was preparing for one. And in preparing, it was rearranging who would absorb the impact when that problem surfaced. Authority had been moved upward. Risk had been moved sideways. And accountability had been pushed away from anyone with a long memory, including me. That realization reframed everything. The access changes, the meetings I'd been removed from, the way my name was being slowly untethered from outcomes. They weren't sidelining me because I was expendable. They were sidelining me because I was inconvenient. Because I remembered too much. Because I asked questions that didn't disappear when answered poorly. Because my presence made certain decisions harder to justify after the fact. Once I saw that, I couldn't unsee it. The value being taken wasn't mine alone. It was the city's, though no one seemed to recognize that yet. Systems rely on people who know where the cracks are. Remove them, and everything looks smoother until it breaks. And when it breaks, the absence of that person becomes useful. That was the part that made my stomach tighten. I began to understand that whatever was coming, my role in it had already been defined without my consent. Not as a contributor, not as a safeguard, as distance. I started thinking differently about my options, not emotionally, strategically. If my credibility was being eroded quietly, then defending it loudly would only accelerate the process. Protests would mark me as defensive. Emotional reactions would feed the narrative that something was wrong with me. I needed to stay boring, invisible even. So I did my work, all of it, thoroughly. I responded to emails promptly. I offered support when asked. I documented everything I touched, storing copies where I was allowed to, and some where I wasn't sure yet whether I'd need them. Not to protect myself. Not yet. To preserve the truth in its original order. At home, my routine stayed the same. I woke up early. I walked Milo. I cooked dinner. I folded laundry while listening to podcasts that had nothing to do with work. Anyone looking in from the outside would have seen a woman whose life was unchanged. Inside, something had shifted. I stopped assuming good faith. Not because I believed everyone was malicious, but because I'd learned that systems don't require malice to do harm. They require momentum. They require silence. They require people like me to keep things running while decisions happen elsewhere. The final confirmation came late one afternoon when an email arrived marked, "For your information." It was a draft response to an external inquiry, a kind I'd handled before. The language was careful. Defensive, without admitting fault. I read it slowly, line by line. The email referenced a process I'd designed, but it didn't credit me. Worse, it implied the process had failed, not catastrophically, not illegally, just enough to justify enhancements. Enhancements that explained why my authority had been removed. I stared at the screen, my cursor blinking at the end of the forwarded message. There it was. The story they were building. A system that needed correction. A department that needed restructuring. And a role that needed to be minimized. My role. I forwarded the email to myself and closed my inbox. That night, I didn't sleep much. Not because I was anxious, but because my mind wouldn't slow down. Pieces were clicking together, forming a picture that was less dramatic than I'd expected and far more dangerous. No one was accusing me. They were rewriting me, reducing my presence to background noise while positioning others as solutions to problems I'd quietly managed for years. That was the real loss. Not power, not status, but the ability to be believed later, when belief would matter most. I lay awake listening to Milo's breathing, steady and unconcerned, and thought about how easy it is to take credibility for granted, how long it takes to build, how quickly it can be redistributed without your input. By morning, I understood something with unsettling clarity. Whatever came next, it wouldn't be about whether I was right. It would be about whether I still existed in the record. And if I didn't, the truth wouldn't need to be hidden. It would simply have no one left to say it out loud. The notification came on a Thursday afternoon, the kind of time chosen precisely because it discourages reaction. It wasn't addressed to me directly. It was an agenda attachment to a city council subcommittee meeting scheduled for the following week. Buried between routine line items, parking permits, sidewalk repairs, a zoning variance was a single bullet point that made my breath catch. Discussion and approval of revised procurement authority framework. It's Fiverr. I clicked it open, already knowing what I'd find. The document was 6 pages long, clean, formal, written in the careful, neutral language that turns decisions into inevitabilities. I read it once without emotion, then again more slowly, letting the implications settle. The revised framework consolidated final approval authority under a newly created role: Interim Director of Contract Oversight. The role would report directly to finance. Procurement analysts would support review functions but would no longer serve as primary approvers. My name appeared exactly once, under a section titled Current Staffing Considerations. It wasn't framed as a demotion. It wasn't framed as discipline. It was framed as alignment. Emily Carter has provided consistent operational support and will continue to contribute subject matter expertise as needed. As needed. I sat back in my chair and stared at the ceiling tiles, counting the faint water stains I'd never noticed before. The office hummed around me. Someone was microwaving popcorn. A printer whirred to life down the hall. No one came to tell me. No one needed to. The framework wasn't a proposal. It was written in the past tense, describing changes that had already been implemented on an interim basis. The meeting wasn't about whether this would happen. It was about ratifying the narrative. I scrolled down to the list of contributors. Mark's name was there. So was the man from finance. So were 2 names I recognized from legal. Mine wasn't. I didn't feel angry. That surprised me. I felt clear. This was the event everything else had been moving toward. The reason for the access changes. The meetings without me. The emails that spoke around my existence instead of to it. This wasn't about performance. It was about positioning. And now it was public. I printed the document and placed it face down on my desk. I didn't read it again. I didn't forward it to myself. I didn't take notes. I stood up, grabbed my bag, and left the office without telling anyone where I was going. The air outside was heavy, the kind that presses against your skin. I walked without direction for a few blocks, letting the noise of traffic fill the space where my thoughts usually raced. I thought about calling someone, a friend, my mother, anyone who could react on my behalf, who could say, "That's not right," with the certainty I hadn't allowed myself yet. I didn't. I knew that once I spoke it out loud, it would become real in a way I couldn't take back. Instead, I went home. Milo greeted me at the door with the same enthusiasm he always did, tail wagging, leash already in his mouth. I took him for a walk, longer than usual, letting the repetition of movement ground me. The sun dipped lower, casting the neighborhood in gold. A couple waved as they passed. Someone was grilling in their backyard. Ordinary life continued, unaware that mine had shifted on a structural level. That night, I opened the folder I'd been quietly building since the first week my access disappeared. It wasn't organized yet, not the way I liked things. It was a collection of memos, emails, approval logs, meeting notes, documents I was allowed to have and a few I technically wasn't, saved before permissions changed. I didn't know exactly what I was looking for, but I knew what I wasn't. I wasn't preparing a defense. There was nothing to defend against. No accusation, no charge. This was something else. I was trying to understand how a system rewrote itself around a person without acknowledging them. The next morning, my supervisor returned from leave. She called me into her office before I could ask for a meeting. "I assume you've seen the agenda," she said, not unkindly. "Yes," I said. She nodded, folding her hands on the desk. "This isn't personal." I almost laughed. Not because it was funny, but because it was predictable. "It never is," I said. She hesitated. "You've done good work here, Emily. This doesn't change that." "It changes what I'm allowed to do," I said. She sighed. "Temporarily." I looked at her, really looked at her, and realized she believed that, or needed to. "When was the decision made?" I asked. She glanced down at her notes. "Early March. Ingressed. 2 months ago. And I wasn't consulted," I said. "No," she admitted. "You weren't." I nodded slowly. "Thank you for being honest." She looked relieved, as if honesty were a favor she'd been holding on to. After I left her office, I didn't return to my desk right away. I went to the records room instead, a place few people visited unless they needed something specific. Rows of filing cabinets hummed under fluorescent lights. The air smelled faintly of dust and paper. I pulled older procurement reports, the ones from before the restructuring. I compared them to the newer versions. The differences were subtle but consistent. Language softened, accountability diffused, references to individual approvals replaced with collective phrasing. It was all there. Not proof of wrongdoing, proof of intent. By the end of the day, the meeting agenda had circulated widely. People stopped by my desk, offering sympathetic looks. A few said, "I'm sure it's nothing." Others avoided eye contact entirely. Mark didn't come by. He sent an email instead. "Let's catch up next week," it said. "Happy to walk through any questions." "Any questions?" I didn't respond. The council meeting was held the following Tuesday, streamed online like all the others. I watched it from my desk, volume low, pretending to work. The framework was approved without discussion. One council member asked a question about efficiency, another asked about cost savings. The answers were smooth, rehearsed. No one mentioned the people affected. No one needed to. When the vote passed, the chair thanked the contributors and moved on to the next item. The screen refreshed. The meeting continued. Just like that, my role was officially rewritten. Not eliminated. Redefined. After work, I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine. I thought about the last 6 years, the trust I'd placed in people and processes, the assumption that if something mattered, it would announce itself clearly. This had announced itself quietly. And that was the lesson. Systems don't collapse with noise. They adjust, they absorb, they rationalize. They move people like pieces, not because they are cruel, but because they are efficient. As I drove home, I understood that this was the point of no return, not because I couldn't get my authority back, but because I now saw the rules for what they were. And once you see them, you have a choice. You can argue inside them, or you can wait, learn them fully, and decide when and how to speak in a language they can't ignore. That night, I labeled the folder on my laptop. Not defense. Not evidence. Just a date. The day my role became official without me. I didn't know yet what I would do with what I was collecting, but I knew I wouldn't rush. Because whatever came next would require patience. And a very clear understanding of how the system preferred its truths delivered. I didn't set out to find proof. That implies intention, a clear goal, a sense of confrontation waiting at the end. What I was doing didn't feel like that. It felt closer to listening. Once my authority was formally redefined, my days became quieter. Fewer meetings, fewer urgent emails, fewer people stopping by my desk with questions that couldn't be answered by policy manuals. On paper, my workload had lightened. In reality, it had shifted. I was still asked to prepare documentation, still asked to review historical records, still asked to sense-check language before things went out the door. My input just traveled differently now. It moved sideways, filtered through others, detached from my name. That detachment gave me something I hadn't had before: time. I used it the way I always had, methodically, without drama. I stopped volunteering opinions unless asked. I stopped correcting people in meetings when they spoke imprecisely. I let things pass that I would have flagged months earlier. Instead, I watched. I watched how documents changed as they moved through hands that weren't used to carrying them. I watched how questions were framed to invite certain answers and discourage others. I watched how responsibility shifted not by declaration, but by omission. The first concrete pattern emerged in the audit logs. Most people never look at audit trails unless they're required to. They're boring, dense. Rows of timestamps and user IDs that blur together after a while. But I'd always liked them. They tell a story if you're patient enough to read it. I pulled logs from before and after the restructuring and laid them side by side. Nothing dramatic jumped out at first. Approvals were still happening. Deadlines were still being met. On the surface, the process looked intact. But the sequence had changed. Approvals that used to move linearly now looped. Documents bounced between roles with overlapping authority, sometimes returning to the same person under a different title. In a few cases, final approval was logged within minutes of initial review, skipping the informal back and forth that usually caught errors. Efficiency, someone might call it. I called it compression. Compression hides things. It removes space where questions form. I flagged nothing. I saved everything. Then there were the emails. Not the ones sent to me, but the ones I was copied on late, or not at all. When I compared threads, I noticed how language softened as it moved up the chain. Concerns became considerations. Risks became variables. Explicit warnings turned into items to monitor. By the time a decision reached the top, it barely resembled the issue it had started as. I recognized the technique. I'd seen vendors use it for years. Strip a problem of its teeth, and it becomes easier to approve. What surprised me was seeing it used internally. One afternoon, while organizing files for legal, I came across a draft memo that hadn't been finalized. It referenced a procurement delay from the previous year, one I remembered well. I'd escalated it after a vendor failed to disclose a conflict of interest. The draft described the delay as a procedural slowdown due to unclear approval pathways. That wasn't true. The pathway had been clear. The vendor had been the problem. I checked the final version of the memo. The reference to vendor misconduct was gone. So was my name. I felt something then, not anger, not fear, but recognition. The same feeling you get when you finally identify a noise that's been bothering you for weeks. A low hum you hadn't consciously noticed until it stopped. This was how it worked. They weren't hiding mistakes. They were relocating them, moving them away from people and into process, turning human judgment into structural ambiguity. When something went wrong, it wouldn't be anyone's fault. It would be the system's, and systems don't testify. The more I looked, the more consistent the pattern became. In nearly every case where a past issue might raise questions about current decisions, the record had been gently edited, not falsified, not deleted, reframed. It was subtle enough to survive scrutiny. Anyone skimming would see responsible governance. Anyone digging would need context to understand what was missing. Context I had. I started creating a timeline, not a narrative, just a sequence. Dates, decisions, language changes, who touched what, and when. I didn't annotate it with opinions. I didn't draw conclusions. I let the record speak in its own voice. One evening, long after most of the office had emptied, I stayed late to finish a task no one else wanted. As I logged out of one system and into another, a notification popped up, an access reminder. My permissions would expire in 30 days unless renewed by my department lead. I stared at the message longer than necessary. 30 days. I closed it without responding. That deadline clarified things in a way nothing else had. Whatever I was seeing, whatever I was gathering, had an expiration date. Not because someone was chasing me, but because the system was designed to keep moving. And soon, I would be fully outside of it. I took a breath and kept working. The most revealing piece came from an unexpected place. A junior analyst, newer than most, still cautious, asked if I could help her understand an old contract clause. She stood in my doorway, file in hand, looking unsure. "I was told you know this stuff," she said quietly. I gestured for her to come in. As we went through the document, she mentioned offhandedly that she'd been instructed to route all approval questions to finance now, that they'd said procurement missed things before. I asked her who had said that. She named someone I didn't expect. Not Mark. Not finance. Legal. That was new. After she left, I pulled legal's recent communications and compared them to older ones. The shift was there, too. Language that framed procurement as a risk vector instead of a control. References to historical inconsistencies without specifics. It wasn't personal. It was strategic. Procurement had become the story's convenient weak point. And I was procurement. I leaned back in my chair and let that settle. This wasn't about me being sidelined because I knew too much. It was about me being sidelined so what I knew couldn't complicate what came next. The revised framework wasn't the end goal. It was preparation. Preparation for scrutiny. For an audit that would eventually dig deeper than expected. For questions that would require answers no one wanted to give. And when those questions came, the record would already be shaped. My role in that shaping had been quietly removed. That night, I went home and opened my laptop at the kitchen table. Milo curled up nearby, head resting against my foot. I added one more document to my folder. The timeline. Still no commentary. Just facts. I didn't know yet how or when it would matter. I only knew that once the record is set, changing it becomes almost impossible, unless someone remembers how it looked before. As I shut the laptop, I felt a strange calm settle in. Not relief, not resignation, clarity. I wasn't being erased because I was insignificant. I was being erased because significance is inconvenient when accountability is about to surface. And now that I understood that, the waiting no longer felt passive. It felt deliberate. Because the system could only move as fast as it believed the past had already been rewritten, and I was quietly holding the original. There is a moment, when you understand what's happening to you, where instinct tells you to intervene, to send the email, to ask for the meeting, to correct the record before it hardens into fact. I felt that instinct every day. It showed up in my fingers when they hovered over the keyboard, ready to draft something clear and professional and devastatingly reasonable. It showed up when I walked past Mark's office and saw the door open, the familiar invitation still technically there. It showed up late at night, when I replayed conversations in my head and thought, if I'd just said this one thing, but instinct is not strategy. And once I saw the shape of what was being built, I understood that speaking too early wouldn't stop it. It would finish it. The system wasn't fragile. It was defensive. Every change that had been made, every access update, every language shift, every reallocation of authority had been designed to withstand objections. If I raised concerns now, they wouldn't be debated. They'd be categorized. Resistance to change. Difficulty adapting. Emotional response to restructuring. I'd seen it happen to others over the years. People who were right, but early. People whose objections became part of the justification for excluding them further. I wasn't going to give them that. So I made a decision that felt wrong in my body before it felt right in my head. I stopped trying to be seen. I didn't announce my silence. I didn't make a show of stepping back. I simply complied. Fully. Professionally. Quietly. When asked to support, I supported. When copied late, I responded politely. When excluded, I didn't ask why. In meetings, I took notes and spoke only when addressed directly. I asked clarifying questions instead of corrective ones. I framed concerns as hypotheticals, then let them drop. People adjusted quickly. That was the unsettling part. The absence of friction made the new structure feel natural, necessary, even. Without my presence pushing back, without the inconvenient memory of how things had been done before the narrative smoothed itself. Procurement had been streamlined. Oversight had been clarified. Risk had been mitigated. No one missed the context. At home, the decision weighed on me more heavily. Silence is easier when it's rewarded. Mine wasn't. It was simply unnoticed. I started sleeping poorly, not because I was anxious, but because my mind wouldn't stop running through contingencies. I'd lie awake listening to Milo shift beside the bed, thinking about timing, about leverage, about what information only mattered if delivered at the right moment. That was when I realized something uncomfortable. I wasn't waiting for justice. I was waiting for inevitability. The system had its own momentum. Audits don't happen overnight. Scrutiny builds slowly, triggered by patterns, not events. Someone somewhere would eventually ask a question that couldn't be answered by reframing alone. When that happened, the record would matter. But only if the person presenting it still existed within reach. Which meant my silence had a purpose. I needed to remain unremarkable long enough to stay inside the perimeter, long enough to keep access to the pieces that hadn't been locked down yet, long enough to understand not just what they were doing, but why now. I watched how people behaved around deadlines, how urgency changed tone, how certain names appeared more frequently in decision chains as others disappeared. I watched Mark, especially. He stopped checking in entirely. Not hostile, not defensive, just absent. That absence told me more than any conversation could have. It meant the decision had crossed a threshold. There was no longer a version of events where he could intervene without implicating himself. Which meant he wouldn't. One afternoon, I was asked to help prepare a briefing packet for a council member ahead of a public hearing. It was administrative work, printing, organizing, labeling tabs. I did it carefully, like always. As I assembled the documents, I noticed something familiar. A footnote referenced a policy change that hadn't gone through full review. My review. The footnote cited a date from months earlier, implying approval had been granted. The language was vague enough to pass unless someone knew the process intimately. I knew it intimately. My instinct flared again, sharp and immediate. I could correct it. I could flag the discrepancy. I could save everyone a future problem. Instead, I did nothing. I placed the footnote where it belonged and moved on to the next section. The choice felt heavy, but it was deliberate. Because correcting it now would only trigger another round of enhancements, another adjustment, another opportunity to further insulate decision-makers from responsibility. Letting it stand meant it would surface later, under conditions I didn't control but ones the system couldn't quietly absorb. That was the difference. Silence, I was learning, isn't passive when it's intentional. It's positional. At the office, my quiet compliance began to work in my favor in small, almost invisible ways. People stopped guarding their language around me. They assumed I wasn't tracking the nuances anymore, that I was just there to assist, not to analyze. Emails became looser, comments more candid. One afternoon, I overheard a conversation in the hallway. Two people I barely knew, talking openly. "If the audit digs too deep, we'll just point to the framework," one said. "That's why it was put in place," the other replied. They didn't see me standing there. I didn't interrupt. That night, I added another line to my timeline. No commentary. Just context. At home, I found myself craving noise, TV on in the background, podcasts playing while I cooked. Silence made my thoughts too loud. But even in the noise, I felt a steady resolve settling in. I wasn't angry. Anger rushes you, makes you visible, makes you predictable. I wasn't afraid either. Fear makes you small, reactive. What I felt was something colder and steadier. Control, not over the situation, but over my response to it. I understood now that whatever outcome I wanted wouldn't come from convincing people I was right. The system wasn't built to reward correctness. It rewarded alignment, so I aligned outwardly and withheld inwardly. Weeks passed. The revised framework embedded itself into daily operations. New habits formed, new routines solidified. People stopped referring to the old way of doing things. The past began to fade. That was the danger. Because once the past disappears from memory, it can no longer be defended. But it can still be recovered, if someone has kept it intact. Late one evening, after everyone else had left, I shut down my computer and sat for a moment in the darkened office. The city lights glowed through the windows, reflected faintly in the glass. I thought about how easily I could have derailed this by speaking too soon, how tempting it had been to demand recognition, explanation, fairness, and how ineffective that would have been. The system had already moved past fairness. It was preparing for survival. So was I. When I finally stood up and turned off the light, I felt something close to certainty for the first time in weeks. I didn't need to confront anyone yet. I didn't need to expose anything. I just needed to stay quiet long enough for the system to forget I was listening. Because when it stopped performing for me, that's when it would tell the truth. By the time I decided to act, it didn't feel like a decision anymore. It felt like a timing issue that had resolved itself. The system had settled into its new shape. The revised framework was no longer interim. People stopped using that word altogether. Authority flowed where it flowed. Questions went where they were directed. The absence of friction became its own justification. That was when I knew it was safe to move. Not loudly, not directly, but through the same channels that had been used to move me. I started with requests that didn't look like requests. I asked for historical data, for context, on a minor follow-up. I requested archived approval logs to support continuity for a training document. I volunteered to help prepare background materials for an upcoming review because I had institutional knowledge. All of it was true, and all of it was approved. No one questions someone who isn't trying to reclaim power. No one guards information from someone who appears to have accepted their place. What I was gathering wasn't evidence in the cinematic sense. There were no smoking guns, no explosive emails, no single document that could be held up and declared decisive. What I collected was alignment. Records that didn't match narratives. Timelines that revealed intention. Language that shifted responsibility without ever naming it. I didn't annotate. I didn't editorialize. I let the documents sit next to each other and speak. One afternoon, I noticed a discrepancy in how a specific policy revision was being referenced across departments. Finance cited it as a proactive correction. Legal referenced it as a clarification following concerns. Procurement, what remained of it, treated it as a neutral update. 3 versions of the same change. Only one could be true. I traced the origin back to a meeting I hadn't been invited to. The meeting notes existed, filed under a generic title. I'd helped format those notes months earlier, back when my access still allowed it. Reading them now, I recognized the moment where language shifted. A single sentence, reworded. Original draft. Concerns raised regarding approval oversight. Final version. Opportunity identified to streamline approval oversight. That wasn't an edit. That was a defense. I added the draft and the final to my folder. Still no commentary. I wasn't building a case. I was building a mirror. The more I worked, the more I understood the elegance of what had been done. No rules had been broken, no policies violated. Everything had been handled appropriately, in accordance with best practices. That's what made it dangerous. Because best practices, when misused, become shields. I wasn't interested in tearing the shield down. I wanted to turn it. The opening came sooner than I expected. An external auditor requested supplemental documentation related to procurement oversight changes. Routine. Low urgency. The kind of request that usually gets delegated down and answered with pre-approved language. This one landed in my inbox. Not because anyone wanted my opinion, because I was efficient. I responded within the hour, attaching the requested documents. Only the requested documents. Nothing extra, nothing suggestive. What I did differently was include original versions where applicable, as permitted under record retention policy. The policy was clear. Historical drafts were part of the official record. No one had bothered to change that. 2 days later, I received a follow-up. Can you clarify the rationale behind the shift described in Section 3? It was a neutral question. I answered it neutrally. I referenced meeting notes, policy language, timeline markers. I did not interpret. I did not speculate. I did not accuse. I let the system answer for itself. The response was acknowledged. No immediate reaction followed. That was expected. Audits don't explode, they ripple. Over the next week, I noticed small changes. People asked more questions in meetings. Finance began looping legal earlier. Legal asked for more documentation than usual. The tone shifted from confident to cautious. Mark stopped sending emails altogether. I didn't reach out. I didn't need to. I was careful not to overstep. Every action I took could be justified by my current role. Support, documentation, continuity. No one could point to a single thing I'd done and say it was inappropriate. That was the point. The system respects process, so I used it. One evening, while reviewing a batch of archived correspondence, I realized something I hadn't seen before. The revised framework had been introduced shortly after a specific inquiry from the State Oversight Office, an inquiry that had never been answered directly. The timing wasn't coincidental. The framework wasn't proactive. It was anticipatory. That insight changed how I framed everything going forward. I didn't treat the restructuring as a management decision anymore. I treated it as a response, which meant there was something upstream they were preparing for. I adjusted my focus accordingly. Instead of documenting what had changed, I documented what had prompted the change, what questions had been circulating, what issues had been deferred rather than resolved. That was when the pattern became unmistakable. This wasn't about procurement performance. It was about insulating leadership from a specific line of inquiry. And I was collateral. Once I saw that, my role clarified. I wasn't there to expose wrongdoing. I was there to ensure accuracy. Accuracy is dangerous in systems that rely on narrative. Another follow-up came from the auditor, this one more pointed. It requested clarification on approval authority during a specific window, the same window when my access had been changed without notice. I provided the logs. Unedited, unframed, just the data. I didn't add a note. I didn't flag the anomaly. I didn't explain why the sequence might be concerning. I trusted the person reading it to understand what it meant. Silence, again, did the work. By the end of that month, the atmosphere in the office had shifted noticeably. Meetings ran longer, language tightened. People were more careful about what they put in writing. Someone mentioned an upcoming review by name instead of euphemism. No one mentioned me, which was exactly right. At home, I slept better than I had in weeks. Not because things were improving, but because I no longer felt reactive. I knew where I stood. I wasn't fighting the system. I was letting it encounter itself. That distinction mattered, because fighting invites resistance. Reflection invites reckoning. I didn't know what the outcome would be. I didn't know who would be held accountable, or whether anyone would. That wasn't my goal. My goal was simpler, to make sure that when the questions came, and they always do, the answers wouldn't be pre-written. That the past couldn't be erased just because it was inconvenient. And that my absence from authority wouldn't become absence from truth. As I closed my laptop one night, I thought about how differently this could have gone. How easily I could have burned bridges, demanded explanations, forced confrontation. All of that would have been satisfying. None of it would have worked. This was slower, quieter, almost invisible. But it respected the one thing the system couldn't dismiss: its own record. And that record, once read carefully enough, didn't need me to speak. It just needed me to make sure it stayed intact long enough to be seen. The first sign that something had shifted wasn't an email or a meeting notice. It was the way people stopped speaking mid-sentence when I walked into a room. Not dramatically, not obviously, just enough to notice if you were paying attention. Conversations didn't end, they recalibrated. Words softened, names disappeared. People chose different phrasing, like they were suddenly aware that language had weight again. That awareness didn't come from me. It came from somewhere higher up the chain. The external audit, the one no one had wanted to name out loud, was no longer hypothetical. A calendar invite finally went out, preliminary findings review, with a distribution list that stretched far beyond my department. Finance, legal, city manager's office, a council liaison, and me. Still not as a lead. Still not as a decision maker, but included. I accepted the invite without comment and printed the agenda the moment it arrived. It was brief, too brief, 3 sections, no attachments, no conclusions listed. That told me everything. When organizations believe they are in control, they over-explain. They flood the room with charts and context and reassurance. When they're not, they say less. The meeting was scheduled for 8 a.m. on a Monday. Another deliberate choice. Early enough to catch people off guard. early enough to avoid spectators, early enough that reactions would be muted by coffee and fatigue. I arrived 10 minutes early and took a seat near the end of the table. Mark was already there. He didn't look at me. That was new. The auditors joined last, their presence changing the room without effort. They didn't raise their voices. They didn't announce authority. They just took their seats, opened their folders, and let the silence stretch. One of them cleared his throat. "We'll keep this straightforward," he said. "Our role isn't to assign intent. It's to assess alignment between stated process and actual practice." Alignment. I felt the word land. He clicked to the first slide. It showed a timeline. Dates I recognized, policy revisions, authority changes, all laid out cleanly, without commentary. "This is the sequence as documented," he said. "We're going to walk through it and ask clarifying questions." They didn't start with me. They started with finance. Questions about rationale, about timing, about why certain changes had been implemented before review rather than after. The answers were polished, familiar, the same language I'd been hearing for months. Streamlining, efficiency, risk mitigation. The auditors nodded, took notes, moved on. Then legal. Questions about documentation, about consistency, about how historical issues had been characterized in more recent communications. Legal answered carefully, emphasizing interpretation, evolving standards, the need to balance clarity with flexibility. Still calm, still controlled. Then the auditor turned a page. "This brings us to procurement oversight," he said. The room shifted. He didn't look at me yet. He looked at the logs. "We noticed a change in approval pathways beginning in early March," he continued. "Specifically, a compression of review timeframes and a redistribution of final sign-off authority." End quote. He paused. "Can someone explain the operational trigger for that change?" Mark spoke before anyone else could. "There were concerns about bottlenecks," he said. "We identified opportunities to reduce delays." The auditor nodded slowly. "Can you point to the documentation where those concerns were raised?" Mark hesitated. "They were discussed internally," he said. "In leadership meetings." "Were they documented?" the auditor asked. Mark glanced at legal. Legal spoke instead. "There were informal discussions," she said. "Not everything was formally recorded." The auditor made a note. "Understood," he said. "However, our review indicates that the individual most consistently associated with identifying and resolving procurement delays was removed from the approval chain prior to any formal finding of deficiency." He looked up then. "At me." "Miss Carter," he said. "Can you help us understand the approval process as it existed before March?" Every eye in the room turned. This was the moment people imagine when they think of confrontation. The moment where you defend yourself, where you say, "Actually," and list everything you've done. I didn't. I described the process. Step by step, roll by roll, calm, factual, no emphasis, no emotion. I explained how approvals flowed, where discretion lived, how exceptions were handled, how delays were addressed. I referenced policies by number, not by opinion. When I finished, the auditor nodded. "And were you consulted when this process was changed?" he asked. "No," I said. "Just that." He didn't ask how that made me feel. He asked what happened next. I described the access changes, the reallocation, the revised framework. I did not characterize them as punitive or unfair. I described them as they were implemented. The room was silent except for the soft scratch of pens on paper. Then the auditor turned back to the others. "Based on the documentation provided," he said, "it appears that the process changes were implemented prior to the identification of any material failure. Is that accurate?" No one answered immediately. He waited. Finance spoke next. Carefully. "Our understanding was that proactive adjustment was advisable." The auditor nodded. "Proactive adjustment in response to what?" Another pause. The air felt heavier now, like a storm building without sound. He clicked to the next slide. "This is an excerpt from a draft memo," he said. "And this is the final version." 2 paragraphs appeared side by side. One referenced a vendor compliance issue. The other did not. "Can anyone explain why the reference to vendor misconduct was removed?" Legal shifted in her seat. "The final language was deemed more appropriate," she said. Appropriate in what sense? The auditor asked. Less speculative. The auditor tilted his head slightly. The issue had already been documented, he said. By Miss Carter. He turned to me again. Is that correct? Yes, I said. He nodded and turned back to the room. What concerns us, he said evenly, is not the decision to revise process. Organizations evolve. What concerns us is the pattern by which responsibility appears to have been redistributed without clear attribution, while the individual with the most direct knowledge of prior issues was removed from authority without consultation. He let that sit. We're not making conclusions today, he continued, but we will be recommending a deeper review of governance practices during that period. No one argued. No one could. Because nothing he said accused anyone of misconduct. It accused the system of inconsistency. That was worse. The meeting ended without resolution. No raised voices, no dramatic exits, just a quiet understanding that the story everyone had been telling themselves no longer fit the record. As people stood to leave, Mark finally looked at me. His expression wasn't angry. It was something closer to recognition. I packed my things slowly and left without speaking to anyone. Outside, the morning had fully arrived. Traffic moved, phones rang. The city did what cities do. But inside that room, something had broken open. Not publicly. Structurally, I sat in my car for a long time before starting the engine, not because I was overwhelmed, but because I was steady. This wasn't vindication. Not yet. No one had apologized. No one had been disciplined. No titles had been restored. But the narrative had lost control of itself, and that was enough. Because once a system begins questioning its own story, it can't unsee the gaps. The temperature had changed, and everyone in that room knew it, including the people who had believed silence would protect them. It turns out silence only works when no one is listening. And that morning, the right people finally were. For a few days after the meeting, nothing happened. No announcements. No corrective emails. No urgent calendar invites with vague titles. The city did what institutions always do after a moment of exposure. It paused, not to reflect, but to calculate, to see how much damage had actually been done, to decide what could be contained quietly and what would need to be addressed more visibly. People avoided me in the hallways, not out of hostility, but uncertainty. I had been reintroduced to the room in a way that disrupted the roles everyone had memorized. I was no longer background support, but I wasn't restored to authority either. I was present. That presence unsettled people more than anger would have. Mark didn't reach out, neither did legal. Finance sent a short note thanking me for assistance during the review. The phrasing was careful, neutral, impossible to argue with. I replied with a single sentence. You're welcome. As breast. At home, friends asked how work was going. I told them it was busy. That wasn't a lie. Busy doesn't always mean loud. The real movement started the following Friday. An email came from the city manager's office, addressed to a small group that included me. The subject line read, Interim Governance Adjustment. Effective immediately. I opened it slowly, reading every word as if it might rearrange itself. There would be no reversal of the revised framework. That much was clear. No one was admitting error. No one was undoing decisions that had already been justified in writing. Instead, something else was happening. A new role was being created. Not above procurement. Not within finance. Not housed under legal. It would sit laterally, reporting directly to the city manager for a fixed term. Process Integrity Liaison. The description was brief, deliberately so. Responsible for ensuring consistency between documented policy, historical practice, and current implementation across departments. I read that sentence twice, then a third time. The role did not carry approval authority. It did not sign contracts. It did not manage staff. It reviewed, observed, documented, and reported. The email ended with a sentence that felt almost understated. Given Miss Carter's institutional knowledge and recent contributions, we are requesting her participation in this role for the duration of the review period. Requesting, not assigning. I sat back in my chair and stared at the screen, feeling the shape of the moment more than the emotion of it. This wasn't a promotion. It wasn't an apology. It wasn't even a correction. It was an accommodation. The system wasn't admitting it had been wrong. It was admitting it couldn't proceed comfortably without me. That distinction mattered. I didn't respond immediately. I thought about what staying would mean. It would mean being visible again, but not powerful in the way people expect power to look. It would mean working with people who had actively participated in my erasure. It would mean documenting decisions that might make colleagues uncomfortable. It would mean being calm in rooms where defensiveness would be easier. Walking away would have been simpler, cleaner, more emotionally satisfying. I could have taken my documentation and found another job, another city, another system that didn't already know my name. But leaving would have preserved the narrative. Staying would change it. I accepted. The role took effect the following Monday. I moved desks, not upward, not outward, but sideways, into a small office near the city manager's suite. No nameplate. No ceremony. Just a desk, a chair, and a mandate that hadn't existed before. My job wasn't to fix anything. It was to observe alignment. Every department meeting I attended, I listened more than I spoke. When I asked questions, they were procedural, not accusatory. When I requested documentation, I cited policy, not opinion. People adjusted, slowly, cautiously. Some were relieved. They could point to me and say, "We're being reviewed," as if that absolved them of responsibility. Others resented the presence quietly, offering cooperation in form but not spirit. I noted both. Mark and I spoke for the first time in weeks during a joint meeting. He addressed me by title, not my old one, the new one. The distance between us was professional now, not personal. That, too, was a shift. In my new role, I saw how deeply the system relied on plausible deniability, how often decisions were made with just enough ambiguity to protect everyone involved, how alignment was used to justify choices that had never been fully examined. I documented everything, not aggressively, not dramatically, faithfully. The reports I submitted were factual, boring, even. They pointed out discrepancies without assigning blame. They highlighted where process diverged from practice, where memory had been overwritten by convenience. Leadership read them carefully. I could tell by the way language began to change. Emails became more precise. Drafts circulated longer. Legal asked more questions before finalizing language. Finance slowed approvals that would have once sailed through. Not because of me, because of what I represented. I was the record, sitting in the room. Weeks passed. Then months. The review period was extended. Quietly. No announcement, just an updated calendar. People stopped trying to predict my reactions. They stopped assuming what I might or might not flag. That uncertainty changed behavior more effectively than confrontation ever could. One afternoon, Mark stopped by my office. He didn't sit. "I didn't realize how much weight you were carrying," he said. I didn't respond immediately. Not because I was doing something wrong, he added quickly. Just because I assumed the system was neutral. I met his eyes. "Systems aren't neutral," I said. "They're shaped by what people allow." He nodded once. That was the closest we came to resolution. I didn't need more. By the end of the quarter, the audit's final recommendations were released. They were measured, technical. They avoided naming individuals. They focused on governance, documentation, and the risks of diffused accountability. Several policies were revised, carefully. My old approval authority was never restored, and I didn't ask for it. Because by then, I understood something that had taken me a long time to learn. Power doesn't always come back the way it left. Sometimes it returns sideways. Sometimes it returns quieter. Sometimes it returns in a form that makes other people uncomfortable because it can't be easily removed again. I stayed. Not because I forgave what had happened. Not because the system deserved my loyalty, but because leaving would have allowed the past to settle back into silence. Staying meant the record stayed open. And the truth, once allowed to sit in the room long enough, doesn't need to raise its voice. It just needs a chair. That was the twist no one expected, including me. By the time the review period officially ended, most people had stopped marking time by it. The calendar updates slowed, then stopped altogether. The phrase, "during the review," faded out of emails, replaced by language that assumed continuity. Processes adjusted, then solidified. What had once been described as temporary became habitual. That's how systems survive exposure. They don't apologize. They adapt. My role wasn't formally extended. It wasn't formally concluded either. It simply remained. The reports I produced continued to circulate. The meetings I attended stayed on my calendar. The questions I asked became part of how things were done. No announcement marked the shift. There rarely is one. I moved back to my original desk eventually, though it no longer felt like a return. The office around me had changed in ways that were subtle but unmistakable. Drafts took longer to finalize. Approval chains were more explicit. People asked clarifying questions they'd once skipped. Not because they were afraid of me, because the system now remembered that it could be questioned. Mark transferred departments 2 months later. No farewell email. No explanation offered. Just an updated org chart and a polite introduction of his replacement, who took longer to speak and listened more carefully than Mark ever had. Finance hired a consultant to optimize governance workflows. Legal added an extra review step to external communications. None of it was framed as a response to the audit. It was framed as improvement, which was fine. I wasn't interested in acknowledgement. At home, life settled back into something resembling normal. I slept through the night again. Milo's routines stayed predictable. The neighborhood moved through seasons without asking my permission. Friends assumed the worst was over. I let them. What lingered wasn't stress, but clarity. I no longer believed that doing things right guaranteed protection. I also no longer believed that being sidelined meant being powerless. The experience had burned away both illusions, leaving something more useful behind: precision. I became more careful with language, more deliberate with documentation, less generous with assumptions about intent, not cynical, just exact. One afternoon, a junior analyst asked me how to navigate a disagreement with another department. "Should I escalate?" she asked. "Or wait it out?" I thought about it for a moment. "Neither," I said. "Document it clearly, make sure it's accurate, then let it exist." She looked confused. "Won't that make things worse?" "Not immediately," I said. "That's the point." She nodded slowly, not fully convinced. I didn't try to convince her. Some lessons only make sense in retrospect. The system didn't become fair. That wasn't the outcome. It became legible. That was enough. Months later, during a routine council meeting, a question came up about a procurement decision that had been made years earlier. The kind of question that used to slide by with a vague answer and a quick pivot to the next agenda item. This time, someone asked for documentation. Not loudly. Not aggressively. Just asked. The documentation existed. It always had. I watched from my seat as the moment passed without incident, resolved by reference instead of reassurance. No one looked at me. No one needed to. The system had learned to carry its own memory again. That night, at home, I sat on the couch with Milo's head in my lap and thought about how different this ending was from the ones people expect. There was no triumph. No public reckoning. No speech about integrity or justice. Just a quieter order. One where things were slightly harder to manipulate. Slightly harder to erase. I hadn't reclaimed my old authority. I hadn't exposed anyone. I hadn't even changed the system in a way that could be pointed to on a chart. But I had altered how it behaved when no one was watching. And that mattered more than I'd realized at the beginning. I thought back to that Tuesday morning in my kitchen, standing barefoot on cold tile, staring at an email that removed my name without explanation. I remembered how small it had felt, how easily everything I trusted had slipped out of reach. I understood now that the moment hadn't been about loss. It had been about position. I'd been pushed to the margins to make a story easier to tell. When that story failed, the system hadn't brought me back to the center. It had rearranged itself around me. I could have left. Many people would have. Leaving would have given me a cleaner narrative, a fresh start, distance from a place that had treated me as expendable. Staying meant living with the discomfort of proximity, of working alongside people who had made decisions about me without me, of being present without being celebrated. But staying also meant something else. It meant that the next time someone tried to simplify the past for convenience, there would be friction. Not from outrage, from accuracy. I turned off the lights and went to bed, the house quiet around me. Tomorrow would look like most days: emails, meetings, documents, decisions that mattered in small, accumulative ways. The system would keep doing what systems do. So would I. Not loudly, not visibly, not in a way that could be easily undone. There's a kind of justice that doesn't arrive with a verdict. It arrives when the rules stop bending so easily, when silence stops being mistaken for consent, when staying becomes more disruptive than leaving ever could be. That was the order that remained, and for the first time in a long while, it felt like enough.